Back, we're back, we're back. We've got sound. We've got sound. Is sound back? We're talking about the stability of the Putin regime and the Ukraine war primarily today. We might take some other questions. The sound has come back on because I turned it off by accident because I've got a very inconveniently placed button on this silly microphone. Now, let's rock and roll, beautiful community. Let's rock and roll, beautiful community. Vasil is asking from Ukraine, question from an ordinary Ukrainian. How do you find strength to continue resistance in the world where it seems you cannot rely on any ally or ideology? Maybe in some philosopher's thoughts. I mean, here is the big picture that we all need to understand. When we talk of the Russia-Ukrainian war, we're talking about something that is just beginning or is at the end of the beginning. Because two things are brought together in the Russia-Ukrainian war. Ukraine's project of gaining independence and gaining a kind of political identity, and the implosion of the Russian Empire. These are decade-long enterprises. And there's a third enterprise, which is the dissolution of trusted institutions in Western democracies. So what you're doing in Ukraine is not fighting the Russians out tomorrow only. You are swimming in these three, and there are many other currents, but in these three central currents that impact you. The disintegration or the self-immolation, if you like, of the Russian Empire, Ukraine striving for independence. Is this going to be possible, and what shape will it take? And then period of Western decline. All of these are decade-long processes, which is why it's so comical that Trump thinks he can resolve this conflict overnight. Because even if you stopped the war, effectively the war, under a proper description of what the war is all about, will continue. So see the big picture and see the fact that you're operating in a world at a crossroads. But at the same time, of course, it's bloody tough to be a proxy power. And by proxy power, I don't mean something negative. I mean just that Ukraine depends on Western support, and have extreme uncertainties about what your sponsors are able to provide you by way of support. It's very, very difficult to go into a fight when you're dependent on other people giving you stuff, without any degree of predictability or security, with the broad trend of what they're giving you going down, not up. So that's difficult. But at the same time, I mean, look, the Russians are making progress on the battlefield at a rate of, tenths of percentage points of Ukraine's total territory. So the progress the Russians are making is still very, very small. Now we need to see what happens over the next weeks, and we want to avoid anything catastrophic happening for Ukraine at the front. But the Russians are not making very considerable progress, and they've got considerable domestic issues too. So that's what you're strapping yourself in for. And it won't end well for Russia. But contrary to the sort of conventional Twitter wisdom, that's not going to bear out in the next year or two. That'll bear out over a couple of decades. So I think it's important to locate yourself in that big picture. But then, of course, emotionally, you recognize it's bloody hard to be a proxy in the war, because you are just dependent for your survival on the unpredictable actions of your sponsors. And it's also bloody hard to fight without a clear strategy and a clear vision for the future. Because it's very difficult for Ukraine right now to put together a conception of victory or a conception of non-defeat that is convincing and motivating, right? Because it seems like whatever you do, the Russians will keep coming. So it's very difficult to paint a rosy picture of an exit strategy for Ukraine out of this, where Ukraine comes out stably and positively. And that's difficult because you are fighting for something without knowing exactly what the shape is of the thing you're fighting for. That's also really, really hard. But fundamentally, you've just got to say that it's the big picture that matters. And the big picture is that we've got a 20-year long process of imperial decline working itself out in Russia. And Ukraine is engaged in a battle for sovereignty and independence and a sustainable political vision for itself, for its future. These are all processes that take a lot of time. These are not things that get done or undone in a year or two. So that's some of where we are. Let's scroll up. Ivan is asking, what are my thoughts about Gary Stephenson, the UK public figure who talks about inequality? I don't want to go too much into that given today's topic. I'll just say that he needs to be strategic about how he coordinates his communication with people in positions of power. Echelon, I might skip your question about the government, the potential government shutdown in the US. We could get a chance to talk about it later. George is saying, Vlad, what do you think of Alexei Venediktov's theory that there's a government agent inside the Navalny organization, FBK? It's an expression of two things. Just how depoliticized that patch is where the Russian opposition operates, number one. And number two, how complicated Venediktov's position is today, and also how emotional he can be about various claims he makes. I mean, the story you have to tell about Venediktov is basically institutional. It's that via a lot of compromises and some questionable actions, he managed to keep a free speech institution in Russia going for longer than it seemed plausible. And that's Echo Moscow, where there was a possibility for a lot of people to speak. So it's very difficult to not give him that credit. However, I'm not impressed with that particular claim of his. And I think that currently I'd recommend, if you speak Russian or if you just consume Venediktov in translation, that you consume Venediktov with a proper understanding of where he is at, both politically and emotionally. You have to have a certain filter there, and then you can derive useful insights from what he says. But as a naive listener, you can't listen to him because you'll end up coming out with a slightly more excuse-making position vis-a-vis the Putin regime. Swedish polymath. What do you think of the theory that the US caused the Ukraine war due to meddling in European affairs, such as with the Bucharest Declaration? The central cause of the Ukraine war is Putin's need for regime security, which in Putin's mind depends on there being no independent Ukraine. So he can't accept a Ukraine that's independent but not in NATO and not in the European Union. He has a problem with Ukraine's independence. He regards it as a threat to his regime security. And that's a central cause of war. A second central cause of war is a certain kind of somewhat mystical escalatory position of the Russian regime, which says, hey guys, clear out of Eastern Europe. West Europeans, Americans, NATO, clear out of Eastern Europe. Get out. So there's an aspiration to make Ukraine non-independent, and there is an aspiration to dissolve NATO. So the problem is not so much with NATO expansion, but with NATO's existence, if you like. Now, having postulated these two central causes of war, do we want to therefore go on and say that NATO expansion and the way NATO expansion was done had zero causal implication in the way things went and the fact that the war happened? No, of course you don't want to say that. You've got to be able to say that there are 20 or 27 different causes to the war, but you've got to understand what's central and what's most important. So um, did we provoke it in the West? The answer is mainly no in the first place. In the second place, also no. In the third place, also no. In the fourth place, yeah, a bit. In the fifth place, yeah, a bit. I mean, there's a million things you could say, hypothetically, it could have gone differently. I mean, one would have been um, NATO expansion done in tears. Um, And that would have allowed, and that was something that the Clinton administration was open to at first, that would have allowed to bring in Ukraine into a NATO track without provoking the Russians in the same way, um, and without bringing him into full-scale membership straight away. So um, Mary Surratt talks about this eloquently, for instance. So don't buy into the slogan that the way the West behaved has nothing to do with the causes of war. Of course it does, but this is not in the first instance a war that we provoked, because it is not in the first instance a Mearsheimer type war where Russia is taking necessary steps to protect its national security. It's in the first instance a regime security war. So let's blame ourselves, but let's not blame ourselves in the first or the second instance. Ivan, how much capacity for escalation does Russia have, considering they need to dial up the politicization knob each time? The Putin regime was very significantly destabilized by the partial mobilization in autumn 2022. At the moment, the Russians are doing better than the Ukrainians when it comes to manpower mobilization. So they're not facing a crisis or a challenge there relative to their enemy. Of course, they're facing challenges, but we always have to be relative in the way we speak about this. Could Putin get away with another mandatory, with another forced mobilization? It would again destabilize his regime. I would assess it as yes, that he could get away with another mobilization if he needed it. Autumn 2022 style. I don't think you could get away with 2 or 3 waves of it without really endangering the terrain beneath his feet, and risking some Prigozhinite type eventualities. So Putin has room for that kind of escalation, but he doesn't have an infinite room, but he has more room, and the room is considerable. So let's rock and roll a little bit more. Beautiful community. I'm interested especially in the Putin regime's prospects, issues about the collapse of the Putin regime, how stable our enemy is. I want that to be at least 50% of our focus today. And I know you're interested in this. We haven't talked about this enough on lives recently. Okay, let's rock and roll. Gaffer Bob, without US reliable leadership, can European and Asian democracies survive alone, and what can they do? Yes, they can absolutely survive alone. But what you need is the understanding that the United States has changed. What you don't want is the belief that Kamala Harris is going to be president in a couple of years and it's going to be back to a version of normal. You've got to understand that there is irrecoverable change in America. And then you have to act with a degree of autonomy. Also recognize the United States is in part now the enemy, as far as its government is concerned, is the enemy of many of the West's important projects, and it's allied with the Russians. But the way you approach this is to understand that Trump is unpopular and that you can powerfully appeal to over half of the country in the United States. At the moment, we're acting in Europe as though Trump speaks for America. We need more, and this will provoke Trump, but we need more discourse from European leaders that says this man is the legitimate leader of the United States, but he does not represent America. And we want a different America to what he stands for. And we know that Americans, there's enough Americans who believe in that too. Um, so the trouble is, you need a degree of domestic democratic stability to act that compellingly on the international scene, and that's difficult. What I would say is that, um, realistically speaking, there is a bit of a domino theory that's latently placed in this. That's to say, if American democracy is going to collapse, that will dramatically increase the chances of other democracies around the globe collapsing. So there's a kind of political and cultural domino theory effect there. And we'll talk very centrally about this on the main channel soon, because I'm already set out the materials for a video about how Trumpism is a version of Putinism, is a milder version of Putinism, and how we need to understand that uh, uh, there's a single global ideology that's washing up everywhere, of which the Russians are just themselves one extreme patient. The Russians are not the cause of its spread. They're an extreme version of the contamination, if you like, but they're not the cause of the contamination. They're themselves just badly infected by this wash that is infecting us too. Lunath, Vlad, you've professed your love for humanity. I understand this compassion about embracing human traits. How do we love humans like Putin and include him in our love of humanity? You don't love Putin. You just go about finding him intelligible. You've got to find Putin thoroughly intelligible by not idealizing him and by understanding his motivation properly. What I say is quite generally that Putins are not a reason for us to stop loving human beings in general, because it's part of our love of human beings that some of them will act very destructively. Alexei, what actions is Trump expected to take regarding Russia in the next 6 months? Trump is caught between wanting to engage in a cooperative stance with Russia and the fact that he is pressured not to do so by elements of the US political system and by many US allies. But Trump's natural position, both personality wise, because he's narcissistically dependent on Putin, but also ideologically, is a position of rough alliance with Putin. Let's rock on. Question about Trump declaring war on Chicago, which is absolutely democratically toxic, but I won't talk about it today. Giacomo, can the Ukraine war last 20 years? Yes, it can. Do you follow Yulia Latynina, the Russian libertarian climate change denial commentator? Yes, I do. Not, not, not religiously. I'm vaguely aware of her informational environment. You skipped Russian imperialism and mentioning the reasons for war. No, I didn't. There's a regime security reason for war, and there's a certain kind of escalatory reason for war, to do with a somewhat mystical vision about Russia being propelled from the back row to the front row of nations, which in practice means that we and our alliances are kicked out of Eastern Europe. That's partly why I say that if you're going to be cartoonish about it, you'd actually be better off saying that Putin's problem is not with NATO expansion, but with NATO's existence. Do you agree that Ukraine has much more room for escalation of the war? Well, if you're talking about escalation of war on Russian territory, yes, I think there is more room for that. Um, and I think generally that we are likely in an escalatory dynamic right now. Um, I think the Russians are going to hit Ukraine uh, as hard as they can, and they might set a few new precedents. The precedent they set today in terms of the volume of the attack. And there are going to be pivots of escalation. For instance, the Russians hitting a government building today. Doesn't matter whether that's intentional or unintentional, but that normalizes the equivalent in reverse. So this business of Russia attacking Ukraine's civilian infrastructure in a way that I call terroristic, and by that I don't mean that it's condemnable, which it is. By that I mean that the aim of it is not to kill Ukrainians as an end in itself. It's to make Ukrainians question their government. So there is a kind of a regime change quality to Russia's bombardment of Ukraine. And in response, Ukraine is hitting key Russian infrastructure, hitting refineries, hitting military bases. That dance will, rather than quietening, as Trump would like it to, likely escalate. And there's a general equation in place. The more static the situation at the front, the more plausible it is for us to see escalation in other dimensions of the war. The chickens are here, the chickens just fell. Blind Soldier is asking me about Marine Le Pen. Look, Marine Le Pen has evolved a lot, but basically what you've got to do is, above all, understand what's not French about her. What does she have in common with authoritarian, unconstitutional populists all over the West? So you've got to figure out what she has in common with them first. Second, you've got to figure out what's unique about her. And that's part of the way you challenge, domestically, unconstructive political figures. Cornelius is asking, what's China's interest here? Do they prefer stalemate or a Russian victory? The Chinese certainly prefer the Russians to avoid being defeated. It's very important that I'm not a country expert. I'm not a country expert for Russia either, but I have a profound way of talking about that country, which I don't have with China. There are wonderful China country experts who I lean on. There's generally a lot of, and this is somewhat racist, I'm afraid, a lot of BS spoken about the Chinese regime and what their motivations are, because too many people make pronouncements about China who don't have the requisite expertise. The way to begin thinking about the global wash that we're in is to think of it as a world of frenemies in which there are countries that are allies and enemies in different respects, often simultaneously. Um, do not be rosy eyed about Russia's quasi alliance with China. There are elements of dependence there, and there could be elements of aggression and escalation there in years to come. Certainly, though, the Trumpian project of peeling the Russians away from the Chinese has been just a bit of wishful thinking with no strategy behind it. It is a very central aspiration of the Chinese to divide the West and to pull Europe up away from the United States. Dangling ends. Is Putin popular in Russia? So, if you're talking about what I would call constitutive popularity, that's to say, I believe Putin is a good president for reasons X, Y, Z, and here are the reasons, I would say that Putin's support would tap out at about 20%. If you're talking about whether the population just outsources politics to Putin and in a depoliticized way says, we don't know what's right politically, but we're going to hope that our political system can get us out of any mess we face. So we're going to outsource politics to Putin without understanding how he operates and without needing to know what he is doing and why he is doing it. That's a central position of a large minority or a small majority of Russians on the Ukraine war. We don't know what's going on, but we just hope that our regime is doing the right thing. We don't even know what it's doing exactly, and it doesn't look that pretty what it's doing, but surely it wouldn't do something so bad unless there were good reasons for it, even though we don't know what they are. So if you are talking about a kind of depoliticized um, uh, outsourcing of political power and political responsibility to the Kremlin, then by that measure, probably 60% of Russians support Putin. But it's not quite just explanatorily helpful to call it support. But if you want to call it support, you can. But that's what that looks like. And then there is going to be about, under 20% who are um, opposed to Putin viscerally and clearly and vehemently. So in terms of substantive support and substantive opposition, it's 20% and 20%. And the 60% blob in the middle is depoliticized and just outsources politics to Putin. Now, it's more complex than that because many Russians are beginning to feel the war through it coming onto Russian soil and through economic impact. And there's a certain element of war fatigue, as we could talk about in more detail perhaps another time. But that's how I'd cut it. Substantive support is a small minority. A general outsourcing of politics to the regime, probably a majority. Gerald, how do you square military rearmament in Europe with a welfare state? An example, Germany is considering bringing back conscription. You square it by desperately trying to balance a situation where you have the cake and eat it. You've got to do as much of both as possible, even though they're two aims that will conflict. You try to have as much of both as possible while admitting the conflict. So you've got to admit that we will hurt ourselves by spending more on the military. And we will hurt ourselves by not spending more on the military. So we've got a difficult decision. And that means we've got to be extremely targeted and economical about how we do the military investment. We don't want to invest in military capacity that's out of date or inappropriate to the challenges we face. But we've also got to not overly emaciate the welfare state at a time of a raging crisis of trust. That's just a recipe for Putin fancying politicians in charge of our military budget. So that's the sort of the worst case scenario here for Europe. If it did militarize more than it more that more as much as some people hope, let's say. Um, the worst case scenario for that is that the militarization will prove counterproductive because you're going to have pro Putin politicians in France, Germany, and the UK in charge of these military budgets. So it'll be a useless enterprise. But you hope to avoid it, and you hope to do as much of each as possible. But that requires very serious conversations about what our military needs are. It also requires very serious conversations about which elements of the welfare state are essential for sustenance of trust. Let's take a few super thanks. On KV2 says, Vlad, to what extent is this current wash of an ideological type? Is that what you're talking about? A type of revenge by different temperaments of people who were unable to cut it in the previous global paradigm. I think that's a bit ruthless, but I think that there is a degree of truth to it, that Western citizens feel that a process of globalization happened that left them feeling A, powerless, B, um, uncertain about whether their countries were countries anymore, left them worried that their countries were just going to be a victim of a wash of global forces. And that all of this happened without them being asked about it. So I think that resentment is very valid, because there is something both very counterproductive and toxic about some of the most neoliberal elements of globalization. But it's also something particularly undemocratic about the way folks rightly feel they weren't consulted about that. So if that's a form of a yes, as a kind of answer to your question, then it is a kind of yes. Do you think that Ukraine will eventually start hitting civilian infrastructure in Moscow? Well, Ukraine has limited capacity for that, but the trend will be more toward that rather than away from that direction. Mark, Russians are not the cause of this contamination. Is this really true? They have been quite masterful and effective at corrupting and damaging democratic discourse and systems. Well, look, I mean, I have a video about this on the main channel, how Russian propaganda changes the way we see things. I think it's one of the most important videos on the channel. And as you know, I have said on YouTube, on radio, on TV, that Russia is interfering in our democracies and undermining them. I mean, you need to be a bit of a tool to deny that, right? Because Russia's theory of victory over us is domestic collapse in the West, domestic democratic collapse. So we've got to be very clear about acknowledging that. What I'm not going to say is that Trump is preponderantly a product of malign Russian foreign interference, or that Nigel Farage, or that Marine Le Pen, or that AfD are products of malign Russian interference in our democracies. That's to say, 98% of what is wrong is domestic. The Russians are trying to fuel it. But we will lose to the Russians if we confuse domestic issues with malign foreign interference. I constantly see this confusion. And it's basically a form of conspiracy theory thinking by resistance liberals that matches the conspiracy theory of Trump voters. Conspiracy theory thinking of Trump voters. And our conspiratorial idea is that there's actually nothing really wrong with our democracies. They're not being ruined by various kinds of economic exclusion. They're not being ruined by the untethering of social bonds. They're not being ruined by the state of social media. They're not being ruined by the proliferation of ideologies of self realization that are incompatible with the public good and solidarity. They're not being ruined by various forms of general malaise of modernity. They're not being ruined by a critical need for institutional reform and institutional supplementation that we're not acting on. They're not being ruined by us not acting on an absolutely urgent need to transcend in practice and in discourse the technocratic centrism that is lamely failing in its opposition to authoritarian populism. Um, Almost all the challenges we face are domestic. The Russians are making them worse, but the Russians are lame and the Russians are incompetent, and their capacity to make things worse is real but limited. And we've got to start by understanding that we've got to have a balance in our heads about what's what. And if the balance is way, way off, we can't begin solving the problem. And the best way to be resistant to malign Russian foreign interference is precisely to try to regenerate trust in our democracy so that citizens don't fall for Russian manipulation of the informational environment. So that's the balance. You've got to admit the reality of both, but you've got to strike that balance. Boris, what can we do when the most privileged nations on earth are falling for the same basic narratives of the current right? Um, Look, I watched the latest political gathering of the Reform Party in the UK, and they looked like an unfathomable bunch of untrustworthy, irresponsible clowns. But I also would say that these irresponsible entrepreneurial clowns, led by the clown of clowns, Nigel Farage, um, Patrick, thank you, um, are doing a better job of speaking to the sentiments of voters on the doorstep than Keir Starmer and the Labour Party and the government with a massive majority. So we have got a real problem because even when these irresponsible right forces are incompetent, they're still beating what's put before them, or at least will start doing so in the next election cycle or two. So that's what it means for there to be an historical tendency, right? It means that something is not determined to happen. It's not determined that in a European country X, authoritarian right populism will come to power. What the tendency does is make it much easier for that to happen. And so you've got a situation where, quite frankly, the path of least resistance politically is irresponsible post-truth right authoritarianism right now, which is actually not conservative politics, it's anti-conservative politics, because conservatives, proper conservatives, are constitutional. And so that's very difficult, because if you're a responsible political actor, you can come up against somebody who's 3 times less competent than you, but they're going to be as effective as you in this political environment because the historical tendency is on their side. But the answer is we've got to still find a way of beating these people, and realize that that's both possible in a country by country basis, but also that beating them or not beating them isn't a black or white thing. We can always make one bit of extra progress against this global, unconstitutional, anti-democratic right revolution. I'm going to talk about the 3 elements that constitute it next on the main channel, which are monarchism, fascism, and neoliberalism. But it's a very compelling wave, and we need all hands on deck on a case by case basis to defeat it. Vlad, how much do you think public institutional mistrust is a consequence of propaganda? PragerU, Rush Limbaugh. Yeah, I mean, do you want me to put a number on it? I'm going to say 22%. So 78%, it's a product of social forces causing mistrust, which then leads to people to fall for disinformation and misinformation. So the challenge of disinformation and misinformation is not that we have to correct the facts that people are getting wrong, it's that we have to regain people's trust. So it's a crisis of trust, not a crisis of misinformation. Time trader. Great question, Vlad. Why does no one understand or doesn't want to, in the media, communicate to a wider population that the war in Ukraine is not about territory? Uh, it's the only focus whenever peace is discussed. Well, um, uh, we are stuck in bubbles. Now, I'm not in exactly the same bubble as the other channels or platforms you engage with, but there's a lot of overlap. But one of the bits of overlap is that we're all saying it's not a territory war. I mean, I've clocked up probably, 50 million views, partly just saying this is not a war about territory. Um, so um, the trouble is you're going to go away and listen to Anne Applebaum say on the radio that that's not a war about territory. Or you're going to go away and listen on YouTube to Anders Beck-Nielsen say that it's not a war about territory. Or you're going to listen to Greg Uden or Tim Snyder say that it's not a war about territory. So we're stuck in a bubble whereby there is a convergence among country experts, in my view, that it's not a war about territory. But that convergence is not percolating more broadly, and it's being taken. Matthew, thank you. It's being taken as a territory war in large parts of our discourse. It's very difficult to percolate outside of your bubble. I mean, we're really stuck in a bunch of mental worlds and in a bunch of fact worlds together. And so when I say that it's a war, Lane, thank you. It's a war about other things, not primarily territory. That Putin is trying to gain Ukrainian territory as a way of establishing ungovernability on Ukrainian territory and undermining the West by deflating the West's prospects of coping with democratic decline domestically, and as a consequence of that, undermining the West's capacity to uh, operate effectively as a coherent force on the international stage. But when we say all of this, we are largely stuck in a bunch of fact bubbles and interpretation bubbles out of which it's very difficult to get out. And that's partly why the way I operate on this channel is by focusing on process, not on conclusion, in the way we think about the world. You've noticed that, right? I don't give a hoot what you think as much as I really do give a hoot how you think and whether I'm contributing to you thinking better, to you freaking out less, to you being more grounded, to you questioning in a more sustainable way some of your outlook. But where you land is of secondary importance to me. And that's why we do this sort of ridiculous repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat thing where we talk together. There are strategies for getting out of these information bubbles that we're in, but it would require perhaps a degree of greater regulation of social media, and it would require journalistic institutions that have a responsibility to speak to countries as a whole, doing a much more courageous and effective way of doing of achieving that, whether that's the BBC or the New York Times. So we need journalistic institutions that could speak to populations as a whole. Now, it doesn't mean you get to win, because I mean, it's not a fact that this is a war that's not about territory. It's an interpretation, it's a correct interpretation, but it's an interpretation. So it's not that that shouldn't be challenged. It should absolutely be debated and challenged. Um, but the trouble we've got is that um, a correct reading of what this war is about is somewhat stuck in a set of interrelated information bubbles, and there's a problem with it percolating beyond. What can we do in the West to help politicize the Russian population in a helpful direction? So, uh, friend of the channel's Peter Pomerantsev talks about that, works on that, and we might have Peter on as soon as my health is stable enough um, to chat about something like that. Um, just like I say, Europeans should speak to the bit of the US population does not support Trump, so we can speak to the bit of the Russian population that is unsure about what is happening. But we've got to be realistic that there's a limit of how far that's going to work at the moment. We can't assume that that's a way of to stabilize the Putin regime as things stand. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I will do a video at some point on sources and who to follow generally, and who I also recommend maybe following around the war. Somebody's talking about Portnikov, and I can warmly recommend Vitaly Portnikov to stimulate you. Vlad, should I get off Twitter? Look, the simple equation is if it's good for your mental health to get off, get off. Otherwise, don't cede territories to your political opponents. I am certainly not getting off because I do have a much more Trumpist response there to my tweets. And I've got a very small account, maybe 20 plus thousand subs. And I do not get off because there are 7 or 11 or 33 people on there who are consuming what I say and they're impacted by what I say. There's a couple of people there who say they're just on there for me. And so it's easy for me to post there because I often like posting short things. But I'm not planning to leave unless I'm sort of thrown off. There's no reason to cede territory like that. Um, uh, I am also now increasingly going to be answering viewer questions on Instagram. So follow me on Instagram. I've already done a couple. I'll be doing lots and lots, dozens and dozens of answers to questions I get from viewers, answering Patreon questions there, but also answering questions that are repeated in the community. There's also a post that's recently left on the community tab of the chat channel where I've asked for questions. I'm going to be answering all of the top questions that got upvoted there as well. So I'm going to spread a little bit around the platform, and on YouTube I'm going to start doing a few more shorts, just answering your questions. It's not a very effective way of doing shorts because for shorts you actually want something a little bit viral, a little bit funky, but I'm just going to answer a few questions there, and it's going to get 5,000 views per video, but that's fine. How do you gain someone's trust if they're no longer tethered to reality? How do you even communicate? By establishing intimacy around non-political issues with them first before going anywhere political. Why is Putin picking a fight with Azerbaijan? Well, the Azerbaijan-Armenia dynamic is an escalation risk, and we could see indirect clash there in the future involving Turkey and Russia. So it's very much a part of the world to watch. The big pattern into which I would put it is that Russia is losing soft power around its periphery, and as is right for a an empire in the slow throes of fragmentation. Collective West, because everyone remembered to click the like button. No, I'm sure they haven't. Rachel says, I don't check Twitter very often these days, but I'm not deleting my account. I actually think I mean, that sounds like completely banal, but it's actually quite a good point. Um, we often sort of over determine questions like, should I or should I not be on that platform? Just be there every 4 months, you know? Don't get so worked up about how your online presence works. Just take it as it comes and see what's natural for you. Vlad, to what extent should politicians of all stripes take their voters with their reasoning, spend a lot more time walking people through the considerations behind their positions? About 10x than was necessary before. So if I am the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and Keir is not natural at this, but I literally get out my flip phone and I say, hey, Brits, end of the day here. It's 11:58 p.m. Um, it's been a mixed day. Here is what I did. Here is what's on my mind. Here is what I'm committed to working really hard to make possible. Here is what I'm really struggling with. I'm really trying to do this, but it's hard. Good night. Sleep well. Talk to you tomorrow. So we need much, much more of that from politicians because we're in a crisis of trust. So we need politicians to bring people around behind the scenes and actually show them that politics is still real, that politics is happening, make them taste it. Make them taste it. So that's very, very important. So a day in the life of a prime minister is a very important video that all presidents and prime ministers need to make from time to time. So direct communication with the voters is very, very important because there's a corrosive degree of mistrust that leads millions of Brits to think that Keir Starmer isn't even real, that he's some kind of globalist puppet. Thoughts on the US deporting failed amnesty seekers from Russia? uh, Russian dissidents are lobbying Canada to take them. Is that fair to others in need? Um, well, fair or not, certainly sending oppositional Russians back to Russia um, it favors the Putin regime and is very bad on the human rights level. But the conflicts of needs there, and generally we've got a very, very agonizing situation around all immigration discourse. But no, it's obviously politically favorable to the Putin regime if we send back to Russia people who oppose him. Bridget is saying, looking good, Vlad. Um, Sending a hug back to you in Germany. Honestly, Collective West is saying, I don't think Brits want to hear another bland message from Keir Starmer. Well, they don't, but they need a non-bland message from their politicians. Otherwise, they're going to vote for Nigel Farage. Between the US and Europe, which of these two places is it hardest to stop democratic decline? US institutions, on average, are more resilient than the institutions of most European countries. They're going to hold out more as they're smashed by authoritarian political currents. But US political culture is more toxic than that of virtually any major European country. So the US is more democratically declined culturally, but more democratically robust institutionally. Gaffer Bob says that's what Zelensky does nightly. He addresses the nation. Funnily enough, though, I mean, Zelensky is himself struggling to communicate with Ukrainians. A lot of people feel that he is repeating talking points, um, and speaking in evasive populist slogans that don't have the same friction they had in 2022, 2023. So Zelensky, don't over romanticize Zelensky's extraordinary way of connecting with the Ukrainian people. He's struggling. But it's not easy for him because he needs to come up with a strategic vision for Ukraine's future. But in a world of such radical uncertainty, how do you piece this together? It's a difficult predicament. Is more continuous direct communication by heads of state a necessary new norm? I think tendentiously, as I've just said a moment ago, and it's just worth repeating myself because this is so important. I think yes. I think that we need much more direct communication between political representatives, and those who've elected them, on social media, on whatever platform they choose. They can fire off emails, they can fire off Substacks, whatever they want. Um, because it's very important that citizens do not engage in magical thinking about what these politicians that they voted for or voted against are doing. Um, you know, in the UK, the average citizen does not grasp what the powers of a member of parliament are. A lot of frustrations that UK citizens feel are just not commensurate with a realistic understanding of the powers that the people they're resentful of actually have. So, making the reality of politics, the way political actors partake in politics, three-dimensional is very important. It restores, if not trust, then it restores a sort of permeation of the opacity, a breakthrough in the opacity that people now regard politics with. Person of interest, thank you for lovely wishes. Do you expect Jan is asking the rise of political violence in this global wash of authoritarianism? Yeah, it's not going to be, if you're talking domestic political violence, it's not going to be modeled on the 1930s in Europe, but we're going to increasingly see uh, coercive politics of enemies being deployed by irresponsible political figures in the West. Have I looked at Gavin Newsom's new strategy emulating Trump's messaging? I think it's a breath of fresh air. Well, as long as Gavin remains politically tethered and remains serious about questioning not just on the surface but in substance what actually went wrong with the neoliberal technocratic centrism that the Democrats have been offering. Neil is asking why are so many people in the West so disgruntled, and the most disgruntled are the younger generations. I think that there are the social forces which I mentioned a moment ago causing this, from the state of the internet to the untethering of social bonds to ideologies of self-realization to economic exclusion, um, causing feelings of unsafety, powerlessness, betrayal, and a sense of opacity about politics. So that's the main point. You have to understand this not as some kind of emotional or intellectual failure on the part of Westerners, they're feeling disgruntled, but you have to see it as a product of social forces. Otherwise, you will, in a kind of teacherly way, just blame voters for feeling out of sorts. We've got to understand it's social forces causing this. And that means that the blame does not centrally fall on the voters. Doesn't mean you don't hold people critically responsible for holding false beliefs and voting for political figures in that way. Brian, Putin's goal is political control at the moment, but in a perfect world, doesn't he want it all? The way he goes on about the 18th and the 10th century history. I'm not sure exactly what you mean. I think that Putin actually has a fantasy of not being in power, but having a way of steering how power in Russia works. So he would love to be a kind of honorary emperor with somebody else doing the day-to-day running of the country. But he has realized over the last decade or so that that's unfeasible and it's going to have to be him. And he feels really reluctant about that. So he's not thrilled about doing his job day to day. He's exhausted and he feels pushed and pressed and often at the edge of his capabilities. So that's one fantasy of his. I think another way of casting your question is, does Putin want more than just regime security? Does he want some kind of political and historical glory? And the answer is yes. There's an element of this global ideology, or rather an element of Putinism that is not part of the global ideological wash that is spreading across the planet. The fascist part is spreading, the monarchist part is spreading, which is just the idea that the only form of legitimacy you need is the legitimacy of the person at the top, the sole actor at the top. And then there's also a big neoliberal element to this too. All of this is shared. There's a mystical element to Putinism that is not shared, that is not coming your way, it's not coming to a ballot box near you. And that's all about things like Putin propelling Russia from the back row to the front row of nations. And there he is after historical glory. And there he does engage in kind of conversation with himself about himself while sort of floating over historical maps. So yes, absolutely, he wants that. And he's had a series of historical ego ideals he's tried to model himself on, from Catherine to Peter to Alexander III. He doesn't model himself much on Soviet leaders because in large part, he thinks that the Russian Revolution was a disaster. Are there leaders you see doing the right thing right now to fighting democratic decline? Any role models others should follow? At the moment, I would say it's best to take bits from different actors. I don't see yet enough people combining the kinds of threading through a needle type characteristics you need to succeed in today's politics, but also be responsible in succeeding. You need a bit of populism. You need pro-institutionalism. You need seriousness about the border and immigration without being some kind of brutal tyrant of a very cruel kind about that. You need a serious agenda of economic populism that is not just unrealizable rhetoric. It's very, very difficult. You need to appeal to patriotism, and you need to adjust all social justice projects toward the idea of what all citizens of a country have in common, and no longer base advocacy for minority groups on the basis of difference. You have to base it on the basis of commonality and solidarity. So it's difficult, but you can take things from different political actors. For example, from someone like Amdani in New York, what you can take is a spirit of inclusive populism. Your discourse is populist, but it's not us versus them. It's we're all in this together. We're actually going to focus on telling more of a positive rather than negative story about where we're going. But you're going to have to take bits from different political actors to piece this politician together. I'm not sure I'm seeing that in any major country instantiated in a single political actor. Um, we're at the hour mark. Let's tilt a little bit more to um, the Putin regime and Putin regime stability, because I wanted to answer any questions you have about that on this occasion, given that's how we titled this. But I'm happy to take other questions too. Levy says, in a recent debate, which I clearly haven't seen, Curtis Yarvin argued that Russia is still a democracy, even if it's a managed democracy. Um, what's the danger of our leaders being inspired by this? Well, I don't think it's a question of being inspired. It's a question of being retrospectively legitimated. So here I go as a post-truth ex-conservative politician breaking institutions. And here come a couple of people like Curtis Yarvin who allow me to retrospectively justify my irresponsible behavior as principled, because I am pursuing some kind of redefinition of democratic practice toward monarchism. And Yarvin is an advocate of a kind of monarchism. So I wouldn't worry so much about it as inspiration, but more as legitimation. Mark, of course, we need to be responsible for our democratic decline, but is protecting ourselves against Russia's efforts not part of that? So my question to you is, where's the binary thinking coming from? Because in answer to your question, I said that that is part of what we need to do. And I've said it's part of what we need to do. We need to watch out for Russian interference. And you're saying, but don't we need to watch out for Russian interference? And that, in a way, shows the way discourse on the internet always tends to proceed. That we tend to not hear each other, and we tend to not be able to keep two things in mind at the same time. That's really the effect of algorithms on us. We really struggle to keep two things at the same time in mind. So the answer to your question is yes, of course. How can Ukraine make Putin's regime more unstable at home? This is a very difficult enterprise. I mean, Ukraine has always been committed to destabilization of Russia's politics by any means possible. Obviously, bringing the war in many different dimensions onto Russia's soil is part of that. Don't underestimate how political and regime change driven Ukraine's attacks on Russia are too. Russia's attacks on Ukraine are regime change driven. Ukraine's attacks on Russia are regime change driven. They're not just saying we're going to count up these couple of military bases we've hit, we're going to count up these refineries we've hit here and there. They're saying, let's hope this destabilizes Putin. In fact, that's almost primary in the way the Zelensky Yermak administration thinks of attacking the Russians. What can they do beyond that? Well, they could make some proposal along the lines of what it means to take on authoritarian imperialism on the ex-Soviet space. The trouble is that currently, today, it's very difficult to imagine Ukrainian politicians and the Russian opposition acting in symmetry. So it's a bit of pie in the sky for where things are at right now. But of course, part of what's happening is that there's a generalized conflict on the ex-Soviet space that's between authoritarian populism and its opponents, represented by Ukraine, represented by the people of Belarus to a large extent, and represented by a small percentage of the Russian population too. How would Putin personally deal, Daniel is asking, with a revolutionary situation in which his life is imminently threatened and he doesn't have access to nukes? Would he flee, and how would he cope with exile? Well, Putin partly thinks he is immortal, but partly is paranoid about losing his health and losing his power. So he thinks about all of this a lot. If he didn't have access to any kind of escalation when he's losing power, and the choice was what between staying or running. He'd run, obviously, because he would need to protect his skin. But losing power like that wouldn't convince him that he doesn't remain the legitimate and ordained leader of Russia. It'd be interesting to think about what kinds of exile plans there are in the Kremlin in case things really go pear-shaped. But what I would say is that we've got to be realistic about how we talk about this. Putin is nowhere near losing power. Alyosha, in your opinion, do you think that the onset of Western democratization in the 19th and 20th century was brought about by the rising democratic United States? Do we need a democratic superpower for a larger democratic community? No, there were certain common social forces that triggered waves of inclusion in Western countries into the 20th century. And we have got a very similar situation today where the United States and Europe together are going to feel the rising and falling tides of various historical tendencies that are coming and going. So you're trying to say, what if we had a major superpower that suddenly was a sort of a bastion of democratic flourishment? The trouble is that's not possible given the social forces out there today. You can't defeat these social forces um, by an application of willpower or by an application of thought, ideation. The problem is not that people have become wrong-headed about politics. The problem is that there are social forces that we're not addressing. So, could one country, a major country, address these social forces better, and could that inspire Europeans, let's say, to follow suit if that country were the United States? Sure, yeah. Unfortunately, the reality is that the United States is more democratically toxic than any major Western country today. But sure, there's a domino effect both ways, if that's your question. If the US democratic system collapses, European democratic collapse is more likely. If there are remarkable modes of democratic regeneration demonstrated in the United States, that's going to help European democracies regenerate too. Will more pressure, Doug McCauley is asking, on the oil sector by Ukraine be the end of Putin, or does he have a plan for that, do you think? Nothing that Ukraine is doing on Russian territory is regime threatening at the moment. It is inconveniencing the regime. It is impacting the lives of Russian citizens. But it's nowhere near a realm of political destabilization that would make the Putin regime worried about its sustenance. So we've got to be realistic about how we estimate this. Nor is there anything happening in the Russian economy that poses a medium-term threat to the survival of the Putin regime. There are a lot of challenges in the Russian economy, but they're not regime-threatening challenges. And that's one of the risks. Maybe there was a question I missed about economic collapse in Russia. That's one of the risks with the conversation about economic collapse in Russia. There's plenty of economic degeneration in Russia, but and plenty modalities of economic crisis. But when we talk about economic collapse, what we tend to actually mean is political collapse without saying so. But at the moment, in the analysis of, in my own analysis, I am not seeing anything from economic experts I trust that would make me think that there are imminent concerns for regime sustainability for Putin. That doesn't mean you don't put pressure. Can Putin miscalculate um, around his relationship with China? Well, the problem that the Russians have got is that instead of dealing with two alternative blocks they could trade with, they're dealing with one that's more powerful than them. And so their negotiating position is perennially weak. Um, could Putin miscalculate something catastrophically in his relationship with the Chinese? I think the most plausible, if not likely, catastrophic outcome is China, in a very dramatic way, taking advantage of the Russian Federation if and when the Putin regime is on the ropes. But that's not going to happen for a while. Daniel, if the US becomes a full autocracy, would it be stuck that way for the foreseeable future? Or could it become like Brazil, going through several autocratic and democratic episodes in rapid succession? So, what I think will be gone once a certain threshold of democratic decline is crossed is the capacity to stably bring democracy back. Because if you have a democratic culture in the crisis and you have very ground down institutions, you cannot return to where you were before. You could conceivably push out of power a government that refuses to leave. But you're still going to be dealing with a very toxic democratic culture, and you could be dealing with emaciated institutions. So uh, it's a bit of both. There can be ebb and flow, but certain kinds of democratic fragmentation are not easily reversible. It's going to take decades to bring. It would, if there were things you could bring back, it would take decades to do so. So, but the truth is that you're not going to be bringing anything back. You're going to be trying to put together new arrangements that have a different form to the form of the arrangements we've had during this relatively democratically stable period, 1989 till the middle 2010s. So, yes, I mean, it's not entirely one-way traffic when you have authoritarianism breaking your institutions. You can push back, but the more they break the institutions, the less leverage you have to push back. So it's both a matter of uh, it being partly reversible, but also being partly irreversible. What's more likely, the breakup of Russia or the breakup of the United States? I think both are unlikely if you're talking about a massive kind of a breakup, as opposed to things falling off at the periphery for Russia. But I would judge that the breakup of Russia is more likely. Yeah, and does it make sense to develop theories, roadmaps to emulate power limiting and social feedback functions of democracy uh, within authoritarianism? Alternative if democracy historically fails. Not sure exactly what you mean. Um, when you find yourself in a non-democratic situation, crudely speaking, the problem you've got is that you don't have avenues for action. So you wait until an avenue for action appears. And that's created by various kinds of circumstances, a crack in the authoritarian regime, some kind of bottom up mobilization, some kind of elite conflict, and so on. And what often happens is that ideas about what one should do develop after that space for action appears. It doesn't mean they shouldn't be developed, but it means that the sort of seminar room idea of we've got some ideas and then we're going to implement them in practice is often not how politics works. Often politics, especially when you're challenging authoritarianism, works via um, a reversal of that order. Opportunity for action appears, and then interesting ideation comes around what to do and how to do and why to do. Having a little browse. Neil, how do you square American internal democracy with its status as the biggest warmonger? Um, well, um, empires can be destructive, or they can be constructive and destructive. Um, the United States is an empire that's engaged in a lot of destructive activity, but it's also engaged in a lot of activity that has stabilized the world. So there is no conflict between that. I mean, there's no conflict between critiquing the Iraq War and suggesting that it would have been good for the United States to support Ukraine robustly. No, it's not wise for Zelensky to go to Moscow to meet Putin. I'm browsing, browsing, browsing. Writing referee, when Prigozhin had his mutiny, would have been useful for the West to act to offer support. Is that something we should think about in a similar future situation? In that particular instance, no, because it wouldn't have been part of any generalized strategy. But if there were a strategy of trying to politicize the Russian space from the beginning of the full-scale war, and if when Ukraine had a modicum of success on the battlefield, the West didn't fold in response to nuclear threats from Putin, um, it may have been a different story. But there is no point in just endorsing what Prigozhin was doing, or as a way of trying to politicize the Russian space outside of a general strategy, which was absent. Um, the big problem with Prigozhin was that he had nothing to offer. He was marching without an offer except the offer of a critique of the incompetence of the regime. Prigozhin's march was, look at you guys. You're not doing anything competently. You're trying to start a war, you can't do it competently. I bet if you tried to stop the war, you couldn't do that competently either. But he didn't say, here's my 15-point program for the future of Russia. Here is my vision for the state of the major institutions in Russia, like the army, for instance. If he did that, he would have had a greater chance of success. Has Lukashenko doomed the prospect of Belarusian independence? How catastrophic has it been? It's been very catastrophic. I mean, these are really people who don't leave power until they wreck their country completely. Um, so it is catastrophic, but in many ways, Belarus has a slight advantage civically over Russia. That a commitment to a resistance to imperialist authoritarianism is more explicit in Belarus than it is in Russia. The trouble for Belarus is that it largely depends on regime change in Russia for its own positive trajectory. And that's a tragic predicament. But it also helps us sort of integrate this conversation about the implosion of the Russian Empire. This is not a problem you solve just by focusing on Ukraine. It's a general problem on that space. Collective West, is there any sign of positive development of a strategy among the Russian political opposition to Putin, such as Kara-Murza? In my analysis, and I'm following this more closely than you probably know because I don't talk about it that much, unfortunately, no. Um, I wish I could say otherwise. My answer is I hope they do better, but at the moment, there is not enough politics in the Russian opposition. There's a sort of a depoliticized and still somewhat hyperactive factionalism and moralization. In a way, funnily enough, the Russian opposition are a good microcosm for us to sort of uh, in which we can see reflected our own social and democratic problems and challenges. So sorry, Rachel, don't know who Elvira Bary is. We can always check, I suppose. Interesting. There's so many things happening I'm not aware of, so I haven't seen that channel before. Destiny is a creep, Rachel says, and Gavin Newsom is a disaster. Obviously, Rachel's views do not represent the views of the channel. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing. I'm just pointing that these are private opinions. She's a historian from Nizhny Novgorod. Yeah, I don't know that channel. What makes Corbyn different from Sanders? Politics to a degree, but also leadership qualities or lack thereof. Uh, uh, Jeremy Corbyn is almost comically inept as a political leader. He's quite competent as a movement organizer, capacity in which I encountered him 20 years ago, when I was sort of peripherally involved in the anti-war coalition prior to the Iraq bombardment. So the Iraq invasion. My I'm beginning to fade. But Jeremy has got appalling skill. So even as a leader, so even if he's arrogant about that, he doesn't see that at all. He's unironic, humorless, and not self-aware about this. So even if Jeremy headed a constructive political project, it would not do well because Jeremy shouldn't be heading it. Whereas that's not true of Bernie at all. If Corbyn goes big in the UK with his latest political project, I'll do a video about the difference between Corbyn and Sanders, because I've seen a lot of US commentators, Kyle Kulinski in particular, just assume that Corbyn is the UK Bernie Sanders, and he's not. They're different. Okay, let's take a couple of more questions and then we'll successfully wind down. Am I aware of Konstantin from inside Russia? Yes, I am. I haven't interacted with him. Hey, Vlad, first time I catch you live. Great, great to see you. You should have a conversation with Destiny at some point. Um, I talk to anybody as long as they don't threaten violence. So I think there was a little bit of mobilization to make that conversation happen a couple of years ago, but I didn't hear anything uh, of it, just by people who consume both channels. But I didn't follow it, didn't see anything of it since. Yeah, I don't know any. I mean, all of that stuff that you guys are talking about, Destiny. I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm not informed about any of this. Kyle Kulinski has some terrible opinions on Ukraine, but it makes more sense in US domestic politics from a kind of a populist left perspective. So I think my sense is Kyle is more pro-Ukrainian uh, than maybe Crystal is. Um, Crystal Ball. But Kyle's a good guy, so he's passionate. He often speaks in a sloppy way. So I watched the video of his the other day, um, probably on something I broadly agreed with him on, but he made two or three excessive sloppy claims in it. But I'm a big fan of Kyle. I think he's an INFJ on Myers-Briggs, and I'm fond of him. He's also young, 1989 date of birth. So I think so. Give him time. Uh, I don't. I mean, here is what I would say. This is actually quite an interesting point. There's a structural problem with shows like um, um, Alison says NFJ is a red breed. Yes, it's my favorite Myers Briggs category. I am ENFP, obviously, with a very strong, very extreme N. Um, and the others are more balanced. So there's a structural problem with a show like Breaking Points, um, or Kyle's show, or the David Pakman show, when they try, if they try, to report on global news. And think about it like this: how can you follow three or four global conflicts at the same time and be competent in discussing them? It's hard, right? And so what happens with these shows typically is that they are right or wrong, but well informed about their domestic politics, but are often very poorly informed about foreign policy. Which is why if you asked Saga or Crystal, hey, tell me how the American political system works, that do really well. If you ask them, tell me how the Putin regime works, they wouldn't say, they wouldn't know anything. So, and that's a big problem. And it even came up earlier in our discussion where Kyle talked about UK politics. Kyle Kulinski talked about UK politics, but didn't know what he was talking about just because he doesn't follow UK politics enough. So there's a kind of a structural problem to these kinds of shows when they try their hand at reporting the news generally. And that's that they're probably going to be fairly informed at reacting to all domestic news, but unless they have special insight, they're going to be relatively uninformed on foreign news, and often going to have very disbalanced positions. They might know a lot about one part of the world, but very little about another. And so that's how a lot of these shows end up talking complete nonsense about Russia or about China. Um, um, but it's hard because what's the alternative? Not talk about it? And I think you need to strike a fine balance. I tend to be conservative about just simply responding to all the major news stories that are going on. Most of them are, um, you know, uh, outside my remit. So, but it's a funny kind of problem with these kinds of shows. There's this absolutely epic gap between the quality of the domestic coverage and the quality of the foreign coverage. In other words, a lot of the foreign coverage is laughable as long as you sort of filter it through the sort of the expertise of country experts, if you like. So